Hello everybody and welcome back to more of our player guide series. My name is Zen and I'm going to be walking you through one of our beginner guides, and while this is labeled a beginner guide, it has some information in it that isn't necessarily beginner, so just keep that in mind as we go forward. However, we're going to be talking about literally the most requested guide that I've ever had on our channel for the past 2 years. Literally at least once a week ever since I started doing Star Wars content, I've had somebody ask how to spec their character or how to do the talent trees in Star Wars. And I've always avoided it because my heart is to teach people how to do it on their own and not to use skill trees that you find online. But we'll talk about that in a second. So the first word that you'll hear me using a lot during this guide is the word spec, right? And I did air quotes, but you couldn't see that. So spec basically in long form means specialization. And there's usually one of two things or both that a person will mean when they say spec, especially within the game. They'll mean either what is your specialization, like are you a tank, DPS, or a healer. So if they say what's your spec, they'll either mean that, or or in conjunction with what is your current talent tree you are spec'd into. What are you have most of your points into. So that's kind of the context of what they mean there. So don't be surprised if you hear me using that term a lot. I just wanted you to know what it meant before we moved on. However, going forward here, we need to learn that there are rules to the talent trees. And just like in any game, you have basic rules. And the best metaphor I come up with here is that if you think of a board game, think of like Risk or Monopoly, basic Americanized board games, there's rules. And if you ever had to play with your siblings when you're younger, or with your friends when you're older, that kind of thing, you usually do better when you know the rules, especially when you know them inside and out. You know what boundaries you have, you know what you can do within the game, which allows you to basically come up with things that people may not expect. The same goes for this. There are rules that come throughout the tree, and you need to understand those rules first before you start making a specific spec. And the reason for that is once you understand those boundaries, those rules, then you know what you can and you can't do, what will and will not work. So the first rule is that each advanced class has 3 trees, and we're not going to think of the 16 advanced classes. Let's limit it down to 8, and just consider the other 8 the mirrored ones, because that's what it is. So if you think of like a power tech, a bounty hunter power tech, they have 3 trees to choose from, and those 3 trees will be the same for the trooper as the same advanced class. So it's not going to be too crazy. The only thing that's different are the icons and the phrases and the way it talks about the skills, because it needs to make sense in the context of the specific class, which will have mirrored abilities. It's just going to be slightly different based on the name and the icon. So of the trees, you have what I call the left, the middle, and the right. I know it's really complex, but with that, there is always a tendency for how they set up the trees. So what I mean by this is the left tree is always what is typically a utility tree. So if you have a advanced class, it could be a tank or a healer. The left tree is your tank and your healer spec. That is basically what you want to spec into if you're going to be a tank or a healer. Usually pure DPS classes, let's say like the sniper, will have a left, a middle, and a right tree, but the left tree may not necessarily be a utility tree. It's not going to be the tree that you'll see, that makes them a DPS, because all of those trees will make them a DPS. But what I'm saying is that for tank and healer specifically, that left tree is usually what is for them. Then you have the middle tree, which is the one that tanks and healers, if they're going to DPS, the middle one is usually a very good bet, right? It has a lot of skills mostly for PvE, and we'll talk about the differences between PvE and PvP skills later, but let's just say middle is usually good for PvE based DPS, and this goes for DPS as well. So for DPS specific classes, let's think of both the left tree and the middle tree as PvE focused DPS trees, possibly with a different role. Maybe one is more single target oriented and the other is more AoE oriented. And then you have the right tree. Now, the one thing about this right tree is that it is usually shared between the the advanced classes of a specific class. So let's say the power tech and the mercenary of the bounty hunter, right? I'm just using this example because my main character is a bounty hunter. That tree on the right hand side is usually shared with names and with the different abilities in there. However, it is altered a little bit here and there based on the advanced class. However, the general idea is usually the same. And this tree is typically used for PvP. The reason I say that is because it has more PvP-oriented skills. This is not always the case. Some pure DPS classes can get a lot of DPS out of that right tree, but we'll talk about that. We'll go through why and why not. That could be a good idea for PvE as opposed to PvP, but for the most part, you'll find a lot of PvP utility in that right tree. So let's continue on with our basic rule set. So the next set of rules are the skill points. These have a very specific rule set that makes a lot of sense, actually. So you gain a skill point, one skill point, every level starting at level 10, which means if you level up to 55, you'll have 46 points total. If you level up to 50 and you don't have the expansion yet, you'll only have 41 points total. Now this is obviously in the context of where the game is at right now, with only one expansion and the max level being level 55, so keep that in mind in case an expansion comes out in the future and this changes. But what happens in the skill tree itself is you're keeping in mind you're only getting one skill point per level starting at level 10, so you'll have 46 total points, which means you gain the ability to unlock a next tier inside of the skill tree. So say you wanted to start in the middle tree and you were speccing up, you would have to spend 5 points on the bottom tier in order to get to the second tier of skill points. So there you go. Now you have 46 points and you have to spend 5 points in order to get into another tier. But this means that you have to spend 36 points in order to get to the very last point in a tree. So say there's a really nice skill at the end of a specific tree, which usually there are, and for the most part you want to pick those up if you're speccing into a specific tree, with a few exceptions, and I'll talk about those in a second. But say you're going for that very last point, you have to spend 36 points. The 36th point that you put in is that ability. So that means if you put all the rest of your points into another tree, into a secondary tree, you can actually never get to the third tier of that tree to get one of those extra abilities. But there are certain times that you wouldn't actually want to get that last point, and it's few and far between, and it's kind of contrived, but they're called hybrid specs, right? Where you put like a quarter of your points or half of your points into one tree and the other half into another. This is kind of experimental, and it comes kind of randomly sometimes when they will be really good trees like that. I would suggest messing around with them, but we'll talk about that later in the guide. However, for the most part, I don't think BioWare would really want you to skip out on those last points. I mean, they kind of define that specific spec to begin with, so it's one of those things that could possibly be nerfed fairly quickly. So I don't necessarily suggest playing a hybrid spec all of the time. So those are the basic rules to the skill trees, right? So now let's kind of move in to what we call pre-made specs, or the cookie cutter specs. So this is something that I want to have you as a player avoid, right? It doesn't grow the community at all. We don't become better players because of these, and in fact I think it actually ruins the enjoyment factor of the game, and it actually makes people worse players in the long run, and we'll talk about that obviously, because that's a pretty big bombshell to throw at you. But for the most part, the cookie cutter specs are something that you find online, and it's just the most popular spec for a given advanced class or class, and it's just one of those things that most people will agree that yes, this one is one of the best, if not the best, and some people, which is the unfortunate part, will take it to the extreme of saying if you don't play this spec, you are a terrible player, which they obviously are wrong and really narrow-sighted on that. That's kind of why we're trying to get away from this, because we don't want that community thing to happen where suddenly you're excluding anybody who comes up with a different spec idea. Most often, though, you'll find these guides online to come up with these specs, or from friends that'll just be like, hey, you should try this spec, or guildies even that really want you to do better. But The other unfortunate part is sometimes you'll find these from people just being total jerks, saying that you're bad at the game because you need to play this spec, and that's most people's experience when you come across these for the first time, especially if you're new to MMOs in general. However, the other sad part to this is people who aren't new to MMOs and have been around a while have gotten really used to using these cookie cutter specs. Therefore, before they even get in the game, before they even download it, and they're considering, oh, maybe I'll play like, a warrior. They go online and they look for these guides of what, spec to do, and they'll have it printed out or on another screen. And the second they hit level 10, which is when you get your skill tree, they'll just go, and it's really bad because they'll just put all of their points into a thing without even thinking about it, and not being creative with their spec at all, which I feel like doesn't make them a better player at all. However, most people like them because they're lazy. There's no effort involved, like I just said, and usually it doesn't fix any needs that you typically have. It'll just kind of fill a hole, right? So you're sitting there and you're like, I need a spec and I don't want to make one. What's the easiest way to do it? Look one up, and you just throw the points in there, but you won't ever get the maximum out of that. So instead, we're going to learn how to make our own spec, because this is probably one of the easiest ways to become incredibly good at the game very quickly. You'll suddenly understand your classes a lot better, and for the most part you'll get a lot more enjoyment out of it because you'll feel creative. And it doesn't matter if you're not a creative person to begin with, you'll feel like you're being creative just because you're putting points into a tree, which sounds ridiculous. But we need to kind of go over a few things while we're learning how to make our own spec. And the first thing is to know that you're not the best player in the world. I know, shocker, it's crazy. Neither am I. It's really weird. We can help each other because we're both not really good at the game, but we can become better if we just help each other out. If you're the best player in the world, you probably shouldn't be watching this guide. If you are watching this guide, chances are you're not the best player in the world, period. This is just how life works, and it's okay. It's okay not to be the best player in the world, because we want to get better, and improving is fun, actually. When you start improving at something, and you can see the improvement that you're having, then it starts to become quite fun. So just be humble in the fact that if you come up with a really bad spec, understand that it's a bad spec, and then move on. Maybe take some ideas out of it, but just move on, especially if one of your friends, if you're requesting feedback on a spec you've created, they say, no, that's bad, and I've seen you play with it and it just makes you a worse player. Just, change it. But strangely enough, starting with that idea in mind, you'll suddenly actually get a lot better at doing this, because you'll take better criticism, which will make you better, and it just kind of is this really cool kind of snowballing effect that actually happens. So let's start talking about actually how to spec your character. So as we said earlier, you are limited on points, right? So you need to know how to maximize the different skills you're getting with the limited amount of points that you can get. If you need to, I would suggest going to Torhead, and there's some other sites that do this. Noxic.com is a very good example, and I'll put all these links in the description as well for you guys. But if you go to these sites, they'll typically have a skill tree that you can use, and you can kind of pre-plan things. That's a good way to do this, actually, and I would suggest doing that rather than in-game, unless you're a subscriber and your respecs are free. But start understanding your limitation with your points, because you want to start thinking, how do I play? Right? What do I need? What kind of things do I need out of my skill tree that it can give me? What kind of little utility things possibly? Or maybe what things do I not need? That's something that you could cut back on, right? You can easily free up a lot of points just getting rid of skills that you probably won't ever use. But this leads me into talking about the differences between PvE skills and PvP skills. So often a PvE-centric tree will have a PvP skill in there, just kind of thrown in. You need to know, if you're a PvE player, to probably avoid those suckers like their mines, because they typically are. You usually don't need those kind of things. And we'll give you a good example here in a second, but if you're a PvP player, by all means take it, because it's really good for you. Now, the best example I have, at least from my experience, is an ability in the Power Tech tree. So this is for the Shield Tech on the very far left tree, specifically for tanking, right? Now, I'm a PvE player, so keep that in mind. I do operations and dungeons and dailies when I am feeling really bored, but there is specifically a skill that allows you to charge, right? It's a charge. You jump through the air with your rocket pack, and it's freaking awesome. But there's 2 secondary skills with this. And the talent to the left of it is called Jet Speed. And what Jet Speed does is it makes it so Jet Charge, which is your charge ability, has a 50 or 100% chance. Put 2 points into it, it's 100% chance to increase your movement speed by 30% for 4 seconds. And while it's active, you getting attacked has it refreshed. So that's what it does. Now, most people could say like, oh, I can see how that would work in PvE or PvP. True. However, if you're tanking in PvE and you're doing it right, you don't need that sucker because you know exactly where you need to be at any given time, and you're going to be there. Getting, this movement speed increase won't necessarily, make you more mobile, because you should already be mobile enough with your jet charge. If you're charging in, your charge will be up by the time you usually have to move again. So keep that in mind. And if that's not up, you have hydraulic override, which makes you move quicker. So to me, as a tank, this is completely useless. I'll never use this. I've tried it. Doesn't work for me. It's a waste of 2 points for me. But in PvP, it is really good, because usually PvP combat is a lot more mobile. The other example to use here is one called No Escape, and we're primarily going to focus on the second part of this. The first part is the same thing, but the second part says that your stealth scan has a 100% chance to immobilize targets it reveals for 3 seconds. Now, in PvE, you're going to use your stealth scan on creatures that stealth, but you won't really need them to be stunned, because if you're a tank, you're going to be tanking them, so you just taunt them. It's not like a huge deal here. I'm sure there'll be exceptions later on where you will need to stun somebody right away as soon as they unstealth, but for the most part, PvE talent, or PvP talent rather, so it's not necessarily too useful in PvE. So you can kind of understand what is a PvP talent as opposed to a PvE talent by just reading through it and looking at the skills it's using. And typically, it's usually fairly obvious. The next thing is to start looking at skills that you need versus skills that you want, such as that jet charge speed increase. Not necessarily something I need or something I want, therefore I don't take it. But if you are a player that may have issues moving around, you're probably not the quickest player, that's okay, but this talent may actually end up being very good for you, because it is something that you'll benefit from. So just thinking ahead of time, like, what do I need? What do I want? What is the difference between those two? And kind of being logical with your tree to begin with. And in fact, most options in the talent trees are very logical. You'll start understanding that the more you put points into them. The best way to do this is to just experiment, right? So come up with a skill, talent tree, spec, whatever you want to call it, that you like for your specific thing, right? So say you're a power tech tank, because we're continuing on with this example. Come up with a spec with that and go try it out. You want to experiment with it, and if it doesn't work, then change it. It's pretty easy, but try to, when you're experimenting, group with friends and tell them, hey, I'm trying out a new spec. This is what I'm trying to look for out of this. Maybe I'll be more mobile. Maybe I'll take less damage, yada, yada, yada. Just give them an idea of what they're looking at, because they don't know your talent tree unless you show them to it and kind of walk them through all of your choices there. But just let them know. And this is the easiest way to find out if a tree is good or not. Do a quick group run, maybe a flashpoint. If it's PvP, do a quick, Warzone or something like that, and then get feedback from them afterwards. Ask them, did this work? Did what I have as a goal work for you guys, as opposed to what normally is, in our situation? Now, this assumes that you'll have a group of players to play with. If you don't, you could just use the group finder and kind of try it out for yourself, although it is a little less effective. But the last thing here with this is to use measuring tools. So DPS meters, as much as those scare people sometimes, or meters in general, it's basically a program that'll run in the background if you have combat logging on, and it'll tell you what kind of damage you're doing and what skills are doing the most damage, and if other people are running it, and if you're synced up to them, you can see what kind of damage you're doing in comparison to other people as well. But the primary program that we use as a raid group is called Mox. I'll have a link for it in the description. And you can usually try this stuff out on target dummies as well. That's another good way is putting up a DPS meter, going to a target dummy and trying it out, and comparing different specs. Although it may be a little different in a live situation because there may be more movement involved in an actual group run as opposed to on a target dummy. And I know I've been talking for a while, but just bear with me for a second because we're about to get into easily the most important part of this guide, which is the idea of how comfortable you are with certain specs and certain rotations. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, what I'm trying to say here is that in certain situations, the most use spec or the highest DPS spec. Let's take the sniper for example. Currently, as of recording this video, the sniper's middle tree, the engineering tree, is parsed as the highest DPS tree for the sniper, which means that most people use it, most people can get a lot out of it. However, not everybody's good at it. And this can make a big difference because if you're not good at the rotation that is available there, then you're probably not going to pull a lot of DPS. And if that's the case, then maybe you should try something else with the sniper, such as the marksman tree, which is the far left one. Now, if you're more comfortable with something, then you're going to do better with it. The more comfortable you are with a certain rotation and with a certain spec, the better you're going to be with it. You're going to be able to move around better in ops runs or group runs or PvP because you're more comfortable with what you're doing, and if you're more comfortable with what you're doing, then you're going to do better. It's just like a snowball effect. It's really easy to see that from the outside once you're thinking about it, but in the moment you're always considering trying to get the highest DPS if you're a good DPS, and most people will just snap right onto that engineer spec and try to get really good at it, but at first you may not be good at it. So try the marksman tree. Are you better at it? Are you better at lethality, which is the far right one? Figure out what you're the best with, because you're going to play the best with the thing you're most comfortable. And I can't stress this enough. I see so many people try to just fit right into the slot of the cookie cutter builds and try to do what is considered the highest DPS, but that may not necessarily be the highest DPS. For example, we have an Inquisitor, he's an assassin, and holy crap can he pull DPS. Did you know what? Assassins are terrible at DPS right now, but he beats the crap out of all of our other DPS because he's good at it. It's that easy. It may not be a high DPS class, but he's good at it. And it's getting buffed soon. I can't wait to see what his DPS is once it finally does. All in all, though, you want to play to your strengths. So try to come up with a list of things that you're good at in the game and play to those. And you'll usually come up with a pretty good spec that'll work for you. Here's the other thing, though, is if you're ever playing in an ops or a raid, as they're usually called, there's an option in your legacy thing called field respec, and you can buy it for each individual character. You can't just buy it across the board. You have to buy it for each character, but it allows you to respec in the field at any given time as long as you're out of combat. Now, this is really nice if you have to respec for certain fights, and as you get more advanced in the game, you'll start thinking of like, oh, maybe this is a really hard ops fight, but this talent I'm using right here is completely useless for it. Let's get rid of it and replace it with something more useful. So always have that in mind. But when you're first starting making your skill tree, keep checking back at it. Maybe every day, maybe every week, keep reading through all the things and see if you can come up with something that's a bit more efficient, a bit better. And once you feel comfortable with it and that you've gotten good feedback from your friendly players that you play with, then maybe only check back at it once a month once you've kind of grown as a player. Or if you're much further along than that, you're an advanced player, then only check back at it when they make huge sweeping changes to the trees, and then you can kind of update it as you go. Overall, though, it's going to require you to be creative. It's going to require you to have fun with your tree and possibly start being a little clever with certain skill combinations and just being logical, basically. There's nothing too crazy complicated about it. It's just putting points into other, points, basically, and creating something that may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, get back up on your feet. Try it again, do something different. That's just basically how you create your own skill tree. It's how I've always worked. I've literally always ever created my own skill tree since I figured out how to do this, and I will tell you 100% of the time it's always been better than whatever I find online because it plays to my strengths as a player, especially as a specific kind of tank that I like to do. But with that being said, if you have any questions on all of this, and I know that you guys will probably, then ask them in the comments below. I'll try to get back to them as soon as possible, and so will our other community members because they're awesome like that. And I have been talking for way too long, so we shall see you guys next time.